Back in December 2007, when I was 17, my mom, my sister Andre, and our cat Whispers moved to Staten Island, into a 4-bedroom, 1-bath house we rented at a surprisingly reasonable price. Staten Island, often called the Forgotten Borough, is the most suburban part of New York City, a place where tree-lined streets and single-family homes feel whirled away from Manhattan's hustle. My mom had always dreamed of living in a house here, especially since most of our extended family already called the island home. The street we moved to was quiet, tucked away at a dead end, with houses that each had their own distinct charm, some with neat lawns, others with quirky decorations, all looking like they'd stood there for decades. But one house stood out, and not in a good way. It looked abandoned, eerie, like something out of a horror movie. Its windows were either boarded up or covered with tattered, dirty white blinds. The paint, which you could tell had once been a soft baby blue, was peeling off in strips, exposing weathered wood underneath. The front yard was a mess, like a tornado had torn through it, with overgrown grass that hadn't been cut in years. 2 old cars sat neglected on the property, a 1961 black Chevy Impala parked in the driveway and a 1959 red Cadillac half buried in the tall grass out back. To us, it seemed like the owners had abandoned the place long ago, leaving it to rot. We hoped someone would come along, clean it up, renovate it, and maybe sell it to bring some life back to the street. I, however, was oddly fascinated by the house. As a huge fan of horror movies, I couldn't help but wonder if it was haunted. Had someone died there recently or decades ago? What secrets or valuables might still be hidden inside? I'd often sneak over to peek through the broken blinds, but all I ever saw was darkness, even in broad daylight. It wasn't until one late night, while I was up working on a school assignment and watching movies, that I noticed something strange. A light flickered on in the attic of the abandoned house. I rubbed my eyes, thinking I was tired or maybe had watched one too many scary movies. But when I peered through my own window's blinds, the light was still there, glowing faintly. I ran to my mom's room, heart pounding, and told her about the light. By the time she got up to check, it had gone out. She went outside, flashlight in hand, and searched around the neighbor's property, but found nothing. Just as she was coming back inside, I saw an old Volkswagen pull up to the side of the abandoned house, its headlights cutting through the dark. A family stepped out, husband, a wife, and 3 girls. The oldest looked like a teenager, maybe 15 or 16. The second was a preteen, around 11 or 12, and the youngest couldn't have been more than 7 or 8. They were dressed oddly, like they were from another era, long, outdated clothes that made me think they might be part of some strict religious group that shunned modern fashion. They looked disoriented, almost dazed, as they silently walked into the house. For the first time in the 3 months we'd lived there, every light in the house flickered on, only to shut off seconds later. My mom stood frozen, her jaw practically on the floor. "Maybe it's nice on the inside," she said with a shrug, trying to brush it off before heading back to bed. But I was hooked. We'd never seen these people before, and it seemed they only came out at night, rarely in the daytime. I started wondering if the kids were homeschooled or maybe away at boarding school, only coming home occasionally. Whatever the reason, they were downright creepy. My mom, Andre, and I started calling them the Addams family because their house looked eerily like the spooky mansion from the TV show, all dilapidated and foreboding. Things only got weirder. One day, a foul odor hit us out of nowhere, like something had died. We couldn't pinpoint where it was coming from, but it was strong enough to make your stomach turn. My mom opened a window to air out our house and gasped when she saw a swarm of huge flies buzzing around the basement window of the house next door. They were on both the inside and outside of the glass, crawling over each other in a sickening frenzy. It creeped us out so much we didn't know what to do. We didn't call the police right away, but we were scared. Later that day, my uncle, a skilled hunter and survivalist, came over. We told him about the smell and the flies, and he went to investigate. The stench was so bad that even he, a guy who'd gutted deer without flinching, ended up vomiting in the yard. We finally called the police, but by the time they arrived, the smell had mysteriously faded and the flies were gone. They said there was nothing they could do without evidence. The day before Thanksgiving, things took a darker turn. My mom and I were in the kitchen, prepping food for the big family gathering we were hosting. Aunts, uncles, cousins, and my older siblings were all coming. Whispers, our cat, suddenly let out a piercing yowl and started scratching at the door to be let in. When I opened it, he leaped into my arms, clinging to me like his life depended on it. I held him tightly and peeked through the blinds to see what had spooked him. There, standing in the dark, was a man dressed in black, staring right at me. My heart skipped a beat. He turned away, facing the abandoned house, his silhouette barely visible in the moonlight. I told my mom, and she brushed it off, saying the whole family next door was creepy and probably needed help. But Whispers wasn't calming down. He let out another yowl and started meowing like crazy, refusing to let me put him down. When I looked out the window again, I saw orange flames reflecting in the glass. "Mom, I think there's a fire outside," I shouted. My mom, Andre, and I, with Whispers still in my arms, ran outside. The Adams family house was engulfed in flames, fire licking up the walls and pouring out of the broken windows. Our house was starting to catch. Flames were creeping up our window frames. And there, standing in front of the burning house, was the man I'd seen, his face illuminated by the firelight. His eyes were dark and hazy, and he looked at me with an expression I'll never forget. Cold, empty, like he felt nothing as his home burnt. The police and fire trucks arrived just in time, managing to put out the fire before it destroyed our house. Miraculously, the damage to our place was minimal, just some scorched window frames. But in the chaos, as we watched the firefighters work and the police questioned neighbors, the man vanished without a trace. The cops sent patrol cars to keep an eye on the house, asking the neighborhood if anyone knew the family. Shockingly, no one did, not their names, how long they'd lived there, or where they'd gone. It was like they'd never existed. A few weeks later, an older woman who'd lived on the street since the 1950s pulled me aside. She told me a chilling story. Back in 1963, a family had died in a fire in that very house. They had 3 daughters, a teenager, a preteen, and a little girl about 7 or 8. She said the father was a sinister, controlling man who ruled his wife and kids with an iron fist. Though the fire was officially ruled an accident, she was convinced he'd started it deliberately. The parallels to the family we'd seen were too uncanny to ignore, and it sent shivers down my spine. Eventually, the police stopped coming around. They had no leads, no one came forward with information, and the house sat vacant, just as dilapidated as when we'd moved in. After a few quiet months, my mom decided we couldn't stay. In the late summer of 2009, she bought a house on the other side of Staten Island, and we started packing. As we loaded the last of our things into the U-Haul and drove away, I couldn't help but glance back at the abandoned house one last time. Just as we pulled out of the street, the attic light flickered on again, glowing faintly in the warm July night. It was the summer of 2009, the day after the 4th of July, and my husband and I were in the middle of a cross-country road trip. We were driving through Texas, a state that, for anyone who's made the journey, feels like an endless stretch of barren land. Sometimes we'd go hours without seeing anything but flat, dusty desert, punctuated by small towns with little more than a rusty gas station and a handful of weather houses. Looking out the window, it was like driving through the same 5 miles of nothingness on repeat. I started to get a headache from the monotony, and my husband suggested I take a quick nap to shake it off. I let myself drift off, lulled by the hum of the car and the vibrant colors of a desert sunset painting the sky. The slowing of the car woke me up. It was dark now, around 10 p.m., and the first thing I noticed was how pitch black the world outside had become. My husband had pulled into a gas station with a small convenience store attached. He said he was going to grab some food and asked if I needed to use the restroom, pointing out that it might be a while before we hit another stop. Knowing he was right, I groggily got out of the car and shuffled toward the store, my head still fuzzy from sleep and the headache lingering. The restrooms were down a short hallway off the main area of the store, with separate doors for men and women. I was tired, my bladder was screaming, and I just wanted to get in and out. As I walked a short distance from the hallway to the nearest of the 2 stalls in the women's restroom, I locked eyes with a woman coming out of the other stall. She didn't quite look homeless, but she was definitely disheveled. Her wild gray hair stuck out in every direction, like it hadn't been brushed in weeks, and it was almost shoulder length, though the mess made it hard to tell. She wore mismatched, ragged clothing, ill-fitting black workout shorts, a pair of worn foam flip-flops, and strangest of all, a bulky purple and green coat draped crookedly over her shoulders, like she hadn't bothered to put it on properly. Keep in mind, this was Texas in July, swelteringly unbearable even at night, so the coat was bizarre. She was clutching a tied-up plastic grocery bag in one hand, its contents hidden. I gave her a quick, polite smile as our eyes met, but she just stared back, her expression blank at first. Then her face shifted, turning wild and intense, her eyebrows furrowed like she was angry, but her eyes had this hungry, almost feral glint. It sent a chill through me, a gut feeling that something was off. I tried to brush it aside, chalking it up to my own exhaustion, and headed into the stall. As I shut the door, I couldn't shake the unease her posture had stirred in me. She'd moved to the sink, but her body was angled toward me, not the mirror. Her stance was tense, legs slightly crouched, like she was poised to spring into action. Her hands weren't near her face, fixing her hair or washing up. They hung at her sides, elbows bent, ready for something. I didn't know why, but I suddenly felt deeply uncomfortable. I regretted leaving my purse and cell phone in the car. I locked the stall door and took my time, hoping she'd leave before I had to come out. I stayed longer than necessary, listening for any sound, but heard nothing. Finally, I heard the smacking of her flip-flops as she walked toward the door. The heavy restroom door opened and slammed shut with a thud, just like it had when I'd entered. Relief washed over me, and I reached for the lock, my fingers an inch away when I froze. I held my breath, straining to listen, and there it was, breathing. Faint, but unmistakable. She hadn't left. She'd only pretended to, slamming the door to trick me, and now she was standing silently somewhere in the restroom, waiting. My heart pounded. Why would she fake leaving and then stay quiet? Something was very wrong. I stayed in the stall, my mind racing, trying to figure out what to do. I had no phone, no way to call for help, and I was alone in this tiny, fluorescent-lit room with a stranger who was clearly up to something. I waited what felt like an eternity, but was probably 20 minutes, barely breathing to avoid making a sound. The whole time, I could hear her faint breaths coming from the far corner near the door, just out of sight from under the stall. Finally, I heard the flip-flops again, the door opened, and it slammed shut once more. This time, I waited a few extra minutes to be sure she wasn't pulling the same trick again. When I was convinced she was gone, I slipped out of the stall, washed my hands as quickly as I could, and rushed down the hallway back to the store. It was pitch black outside, the kind of dark where you can't see more than a few feet ahead. I had no idea where she was, but I knew she couldn't be far. A large man was checking out at the register, so I lingered near a window display, pretending to browse until he left. I slipped out the door behind him, using his presence as a shield. Sure enough, as I stepped outside, I saw her crouched right by the front door of the store. She looked startled when she saw me, standing up quickly and turning to walk away, disappearing around the side of the building. My husband was waiting in the car, and when I got in, he immediately asked if I was okay, noticing I'd taken much longer than usual. I told him I'd explain everything once we were far away from that gas station. As we drove off, my heart was still racing. The image of her wild eyes and tense posture burned into my mind. This story is about my mom, who's been living in the same house for about 12 years now. In a rough neighborhood where gang activity is common and the wail of sirens is a constant background noise. The convenience store across the street has been robbed more times than I can count since we moved in, but despite the chaos outside, my mom has always made our home a warm, safe haven. I never felt scared there, no matter how shady things got outside. In 2013, after my dad passed away, Mom adopted a dog for company since she was living alone. The dog, a yappy little thing named Sugar, is sweet as can be, but barks her head off at the slightest sound. A car door slamming, the mailman's footsteps, anything. It can be startling, especially late at night, but it's also reassuring to know she's so alert. One night, around 2 a.m., Mom was getting ready for bed. She's a night owl, often staying up late watching true crime shows on Investigation Discovery, engrossed in stories of mysteries and murders. She sleeps on the couch in the living room because she says her bed upstairs hurts her back. Her house has 2 doors to get inside, A front door with a large window that opens onto an enclosed porch where she keeps a deep freezer, and a heavier metal door that leads from the porch into the living room. She locks both every night without fail. That night, as she was winding down, Sugar suddenly started barking like crazy, high-pitched yips cutting through the quiet. At first, Mom scolded her, assuming it was just a passing car or some other harmless noise. But then she heard it too, a muffled knocking at the front door, distinct even through the 2 layers of doors. Mom froze, her heart racing as she sat silently on the couch, hoping whoever it was would just go away. But the knocking continued, steady and insistent, and Sugar's barking only got louder. My mom's no pushover. She's a tough woman who doesn't take nonsense from anyone. Steeling herself, she got up, opened the metal door to the porch, and approached the front door's large window. She lifted the blinds and saw a disheveled young woman standing on the front step, swaying unsteadily as if she were drunk. Her clothes were rumpled, her hair a mess, and her speech was slurred when she spoke. "Is Danielle here?" the woman asked, her voice thick and unsteady. "No, there's no one here by that name." "Sorry," Mom replied politely, lowering the blinds and turning to head back inside, eager to put the interaction behind her. But before she could step away, the woman started pounding on the door hard. It wasn't just knocking anymore. It sounded like she was throwing her whole body against it, maybe even kicking it. "Let me in," she screamed, her voice raw with desperation or anger. Mom's patience snapped. She marched back to the window, yanked up the blinds, and glared at the woman. "Get the hell off my porch." "There's no Danielle here," she shouted, her voice firm and commanding. The woman hesitated, then turned and stumbled away into the night. Mom locked the metal door again, her hand shaking slightly from the adrenaline, and tried to settle back down, though Sugar was still on edge, pacing and growling softly. The next morning, as Mom went out to grab the newspaper from the front yard, she noticed something that made her blood run cold. Her front yard is surrounded by a short, waist-high metal fence, and she's always strict about keeping the gate closed. She gives us grief if we ever leave it open. But that morning, the gate was ajar. Annoyed, she slipped on her slippers to go close it, muttering about careless strangers. That's when she saw it. Lying on the ground beside the walkway was a crowbar, its metal glinting in the morning light. Her stomach dropped as she realized the force behind the woman's pounding on the door the night before hadn't just been her fists or feet. She'd been wielding a weapon. The window in the front door only showed the woman from the chest up, and in the darkness, Mom hadn't seen the crowbar. The thought of what could have happened if she'd opened the door sent a shiver down her spine. She stood there, staring at the crowbar, her mind racing with the realization of how close she'd come to danger. This story begins about 3 years ago, around 2022, when I graduated high school. I'd grown up with my grandparents, but at 18, I decided to move to a much larger city to live with my dad for the first time in 12 years. I'd spent summers with him, so the city wasn't entirely new, but this was my first taste of adult freedom, driving my car wherever I wanted, smoking cigarettes whenever I felt like it, coming and going as I pleased. I was thrilled, though leaving my friends behind was bittersweet. When I settled into my dad's apartment, he and my stepmom sat me down to go over a few ground rules. Let them know when I was leaving or coming back, even if it was 2 a.m., park on the street since the complex had limited parking, and most importantly, watch out for the neighborhood creep, a guy named George. George was infamous among the women in the complex, and even known to the local police. He was tall, hulking, and intimidating, with a reputation for stalking women. My parents were pretty sure I'd be safe because I lived with my dad, who was also tall and imposing. They explained that George typically backed off if a woman had a man around. Whether it was a brother, boyfriend, or father didn't matter. As long as a guy was present, George would move on to another target. With my dad around, I felt confident I'd be fine, and for the first 6 months I was. Things changed after my stepmom and dad started fighting more. One night, she packed up and left for good. I was sitting on our porch, smoking a cigarette and scrolling through Facebook when I glanced up, not because I felt watched, but maybe because a bug buzzed by or something caught my eye. There, about 15 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree, was George, staring at me with an unnerving intensity. My heart jumped, and I nearly dropped my cigarette. I stubbed it out with shaky hands and hurried inside. I was home alone, so I locked every door and retreated to my room to play video games, trying to convince myself I was just paranoid. The next morning, I went out for my usual coffee and cigarette, and within minutes, George ambled out of his apartment, his eyes locked on me. I smoked as fast as I could and bolted back inside. This pattern continued for weeks. It was like he was watching from his sliding glass door, waiting for me to step onto the porch. I told my dad, and he started sitting with me whenever I went out to smoke. Sure enough, when Dad was there, George wouldn't even peek out. Other women in the complex had already tried calling the police about him, but since he lived there and staring wasn't a crime, there wasn't much they could do. I didn't know how far he'd taken things with others, but I knew calling the cops wouldn't help much. Things escalated after my stepmom left. With her gone, I got a parking spot in the complex, but it meant I had 3 possible routes from my car to our apartment. One path went right past George's apartment, about 5 feet from his door. Since I worked late most nights, I avoided that route whenever possible. But George seemed to have memorized my schedule. He'd show up on one of my paths, not directly on the walkway, but just off it, standing in the grass or behind a tree, like he thought I wouldn't notice him. It was like a kid playing hide and seek, except 90% of his body was visible. I'd rush past, avoiding eye contact, my heart pounding, ready to scream if I heard him move. I started carrying my keys between my fingers like a weapon and bought a pocket knife, keeping it half open as I walked from my car. I'd never been in a fight in my life, but I was scared enough to prepare for one. My mom even started looking for free self-defense classes since I couldn't afford to pay for them. From November to May, the tension grew. If Dad wasn't home, I'd lock my bedroom door and sleep with my knife under my pillow. I'd Skype my boyfriend all night just so someone could call 911 if something happened. I placed flower pots under my bedroom window to make noise if anyone tried to break in. I started smoking on the porch floor below the wall, angled so I could see if George approached. Nightmares plagued me, filled with shadowy figures and the sound of footsteps. One day, my neighbor Shell was gossiping with me. "Did you hear about George?" she asked. I shook my head. She told me he'd been arrested the previous night in the complex's parking lot. There was a waist-high electrical box near where I usually parked, and a woman walking by with her kids saw George sitting on it, masturbating. The thought hit me like a punch. Was he waiting for me, doing that while thinking of me seeing him? It made me want to vomit and sent a fresh wave of fear through me. I was relieved for a few days, but the peace didn't last. George was back soon after, picking up his old routine like nothing had happened. One evening around 7 p.m., I was out smoking with my dad when a neighbor walked up to chat with him. George stepped outside, standing in plain view, staring me down. "That guy's asking to get his ass kicked," Dad muttered under his breath, continuing his conversation. I rolled my eyes, went inside, and loaded up World of Warcraft, focusing on healing a dungeon group. Suddenly, I heard Shell shouting, "Where are you?" I assumed she was talking to someone else. My role in the game was critical, and I couldn't just leave. But then she burst into my room, eyes wide, hopping from foot to foot like she was frantic. "He's bleeding," she cried. "Who?" I asked, bewildered. "Your dad. Come quick." I groaned like an annoyed teenager, abandoned my group, and grabbed our little first aid kit, thinking Dad had done something dumb like cut himself messing around with his pocket knife. But when I stepped outside, I was met with pure horror. 6 people surrounded my dad, including Shell and our neighbor Caleb, who was pressing a shirt to Dad's side. His entire back was drenched in blood, like he'd been mauled by a bear. When Caleb's grip slipped, blood sprayed everywhere, and I felt my stomach lurch. I'd never been the person people turn to in a crisis. Blood makes me faint, and I panic over losing a bookmark. But everyone around me, adults in their 30s and 40s, was frozen in shock, except Caleb. At 18, I had to step up. I tossed the first aid kit onto the porch and shouted to Shell, "We keep towels in the hall closet." Then I turned to the group. "Has anyone called 911? 5 pairs of eyes stared at me like I'd spoken a foreign language. "No," Dad said weakly. "I can't afford an ambulance." "Shut up," I snapped, already dialing. I gave the operator our address and explained the emergency, relaying that my dad had been stabbed. They told us to keep pressure on the wound in his lower back. Dad, a total champ, stayed on his feet despite the blood pooling on the sidewalk until someone ran to grab a chair. I sprinted back and forth, guiding the police to George's apartment, and then the paramedics to Dad. The paramedics moved so slowly, walking calmly when I wanted to scream at them to run. Didn't they see my dad could be bleeding out? I later learned they avoid running to keep their adrenaline in check and prevent mistakes. They pushed Caleb aside, packed Dad into the ambulance, and I was about to climb in when the police stopped me, saying I needed to give a statement. Dad shouted for me to call his boss and rattled off his allergies for the paramedics. I stood there, reeling as they drove away. For 2 or 3 hours, I sat on the sidewalk outside the complex, giving my statement to the police. One officer was kind enough to grab my cigarettes and a bottle of water from the house. He stayed with me, making sure I didn't wander off, and even offered to let me sit in his cruiser to escape the cold. When they brought George out, there were 14 cop cars, 14, and he still tried to stare at me. I glared back, hatred burning in my chest like I'd never felt before. The officer noticed and used his flashlight to block George's view. While Dad was in the hospital for 9 days, I pieced together what happened from neighbors. Dad had confronted George, telling him to leave me alone. George yelled back, "Come tell me that to my face like a man." Dad, never one to back down, hopped over the porch railing and marched up to him. George had a 12-inch blade hidden by his leg. He swung with his empty hand, then stabbed Dad in the lower back, narrowly missing his kidney but puncturing his lung and damaging his diaphragm. Dad didn't realize he'd been stabbed at first. He put George in a headlock, pummeling him, thinking it was just a punch to the kidney. George dropped the knife, rolled in the grass, and grabbed another hidden blade, stabbing Dad again in the upper back, though this wound was shallower. When Shell screamed that Dad was bleeding, he tore off his shirt, threw it at George, and only then did George raise his hands and retreat to his apartment. The blood stayed on the pavement until noon the next day, when neighbors kindly washed it away. I still have photos of it and Dad's injuries in my email. He was in critical condition, but George spent less time in jail than Dad did in the hospital. George was convicted of battery with a deadly weapon, but an attempted murder charge was dropped. He was out by Christmas, released for good behavior or some nonsense. Dad and I got a lifelong restraining order against him, and he's never come near me since. I can only hope he's terrified of my dad now. Throughout that week, as I sat on the porch or walked around, women from the complex approached me. They all asked me to thank my dad for them. They'd all been terrorized by George. Some said he'd followed them to their doors, pulled down his pants, and demanded sex. The police couldn't do much before, but now he was gone for good. Neighbors and police searched the complex and found knives stashed everywhere, buried in gardens, tucked behind trees, under his doormat. It makes me shudder to think what he might have planned. I wish I could say I took self-defense classes and learned to fight like my dad, but I'm still too nervous to even swat a spider. Dad's doing okay now, though he had his 3rd surgery this past Tuesday to repair the internal damage. We're hoping it's the last, and his quality of life will improve. I owe my life to him. If he hadn't fought George, I might have been his first victim. 5 years ago, my cousin and I, both guys, decided to take a late-night walk through the abandoned section of an old 16th century army fort in our hometown in Croatia. It was around 2:30 in the morning, and we were bored out of our minds. The fort, a crumbling relic of history with its weathered stone walls and overgrown pathways, also offered a shortcut to our houses, so we figured, why not? The fort's eerie vibe was well known among locals, but we were young and cocky, brushing off the creepy stories as old wives' tales. There was this one tunnel about 30 meters long that served as the only exit from the fort's abandoned section. Unlike the renovated parts of the fort, which had modern lighting and guided tours for tourists, this tunnel was pitch black, untouched by any restoration efforts. It was notorious for being spooky. Locals often avoided it after dark, claiming it felt wrong. But we shrugged it off, thinking, screw it, let's go. We were just 2 guys looking for a bit of adventure, not expecting anything out of the ordinary. A few meters into the tunnel, the air grew heavy, and an overwhelming sense of dread washed over me like a cold wave. It wasn't just a feeling. It was like something physical pressing down on my chest. We stopped dead in our tracks, frozen, and exchanged a glance. My cousin's wide eyes told me he felt it too. Neither of us said a word, but the shared panic was undeniable. Then, out of nowhere, a sound pierced the silence, a deep guttural shriek that seemed to come from the far end of the tunnel. It wasn't just loud. It felt like it was moving, traveling toward us, growing louder until it echoed inside our skulls. The noise was so intense it hurt our ears, like a high-pitched whine mixed with a low, animalistic growl, almost like the tortured cry of something not quite human. The pain in our ears pinned us in place, unable to move. It reminded me of the disorienting buzz you hear in video games like Call of Duty when a grenade explodes too close, sharp, deafening, and paralyzing. We stood there, hearts pounding, trying to make sense of what was happening. After what felt like an eternity, but was probably only a few seconds, my cousin snapped his head up, looking toward the end of the tunnel. He let out a scream, barely audible over the ringing in my ears. I followed his gaze, and that's when I saw it, a massive shadow, looming at the tunnel's exit. It was impossibly tall, at least 3 times the height of a person, maybe 9 or 10 feet. Its form vague but solid, like a wall of darkness that seemed to absorb the faint moonlight filtering in from outside. We were paralyzed, not just by fear, but by something else, like the air itself was holding us in place. For what felt like 2 agonizing minutes, we couldn't move, couldn't speak, just stood there staring at this thing. It didn't have a face we could make out, no glowing eyes or sharp teeth like in horror movies, just an oppressive, featureless mass that radiated menace. Then suddenly, it moved, not walking, but gliding, like it was floating just above the ground, coming toward us at the speed of a fast walk. It closed the distance quickly, getting within 7 or 8 meters, and I swear my heart stopped. I thought we were done for, that this was the end. Somehow, my cousin broke free from whatever held us. He grabbed my arm, yanking me so hard I nearly stumbled, and we bolted. We sprinted out of that tunnel, our feet pounding the uneven stone floor, not daring to look back. The air felt thick, like we were running through molasses, but we didn't stop. Not for the entire 30-minute sprint across town to our neighborhood. The whole time, I could feel that thing behind us, like its presence was chasing us, even if it wasn't physically there. We didn't talk, didn't slow down, just ran until our lungs burned and our legs screamed. When we finally reached my place, we collapsed inside, locking the door behind us. We were shaking, sweating, and terrified, like a couple of scared kids. We piled blankets over our heads that night, sleeping in the same room, too freaked out to be alone. To this day, we both swear we saw and heard the same thing. That shadow, that shriek, that feeling of pure terror. We've talked about it since, and our stories match perfectly, down to the smallest details. I tried to rationalize it, to chalk it up to our imaginations or some trick of the dark, but nothing explains it. That fort, built centuries ago to defend against invaders, is a place steeped in history, battles, sieges, and who knows what else. For Americans, think of it like wandering into an abandoned Civil War fort at night, only to find something ancient and wrong waiting inside. I don't know what that thing was, but it wasn't human, and it wasn't a trick of the mind. It was real, and it wanted us to know it was there. 3 years ago, I was part of a search and rescue team for Parks Canada, working in the stunning but wild foothills region. The landscape there is breathtaking, a primal expanse of towering spruce trees, rocky cliffs, and rolling valleys that feels both peaceful and ancient. The Aboriginal peoples consider this land sacred, a place where the earth's spirit runs deep. It's home to majestic creatures, buffalo, grizzly bears, wolves, mountain lions. But there's something else out there, something unseen, something that's lurked in the wilderness for what I can only imagine is millennia. For lack of a better word, I call it a vampire, though not the pale, cape-wearing kind from old movies with slicked back hair and a thick Eastern European accent. This thing was more like a force of nature, a parasitic entity that feeds on unwary travelers to sustain its existence, much like a predator in the wild. What I saw that day shattered my understanding of the world, and I've been trying to make sense of it ever since. That summer was chaos. Severe electrical storms sparked multiple forest fires across the region. Some were contained, but others raged out of control, leaving entire valleys choked with smoke. The sky was often a hazy, apocalyptic orange, with ash drifting like snow. Health advisories urged people with medical conditions to stay indoors and avoid exertion, but that didn't stop the most determined outdoorsmen from venturing into the parks. Fire bans were strict. Anyone caught with so much as a campfire or a backyard fire pit faced hefty fines. On the day everything went wrong, the sunlight was blotted out by a thick pall of smoke that rolled in before dawn, turning a normally bright summer day into something out of a nightmare. The trouble started when a park ranger stumbled across a reserved campsite in ruins. Tents were shredded, one completely collapsed, as if something had torn through it with claws. A car at the site had its windows smashed and its roof ripped open, like a can opener had been taken to it. Debris was scattered everywhere. Camping gear, clothes, food containers, clear signs of a violent struggle in the night. The ranger learned that a family of 4 had been staying there, a father, mother, and their 2 young daughters. Suspecting a bear attack, he called for backup. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police, RCMP, arrived, along with search and rescue teams, including my group. A massive search began to find a missing family. My team was about 10 miles south of the campsite, led there by scent dogs. But after all that distance, we found nothing. No blood, no clothing, no footprints, not even a broken twig. The only tracks in the dirt were from deer. It was baffling. How could a family vanish so completely? We were in thick brush, surrounded by brooding spruce trees and jagged cliffs, the kind of terrain that hides secrets. The dogs started acting strange, whining and howling, tucking their tails and cowering behind their handlers. These were trained animals, fearless in the face of bears or cougars, but something had them terrified. The handlers struggled to calm them, while the rest of the team argued about what to do next. I was a few meters behind, scanning the area, when a wave of anxiety hit me. Despite the summer heat, a chill ran through my body, like someone had walked over my grave. The hairs on my neck stood up, and goosebumps prickled my skin. I felt watched, like unseen eyes were boring into me from the trees or rocks. I spun around, heart racing, but saw nothing, just the endless forest and the smoky haze. Against protocol, I felt an urge to move toward an overgrown hiking trail to the southeast. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was like something was pulling me, a compulsion I couldn't explain at the time. I just knew I had to go. Beyond the brush, I found a cave entrance in the ground, half hidden by roots and moss. At the mouth, something caught my eye, a child's shoe, bright with pink stripes. My heart sank. I looked up at the smoky sky, where a rare break in the clouds let a beam of sunlight hit my face, almost like a warning. Grabbing my flashlight, I shined it into the cave. The sloping ground showed drag marks, as if something heavy had been pulled inside. A faint whimper escaped my lips as I stepped forward. I knew there were caves in the area, but I'd never gone into one alone. Yet that pull, that inexplicable call, drove me to enter. For Americans, think of exploring a remote Appalachian cave system, where the isolation and darkness feel like they could swallow you whole. I had to crab walk through the narrow entrance, but soon the cave opened up, allowing me to stand. 20 feet in, the air grew stagnant, heavy with the smell of damp earth and something faintly metallic. The darkness was oppressive, pressing against my flashlight's beam. I stopped to listen, but there was only silence, thick and unforgiving. Sweeping my light across the walls, I spotted an ancient petroglyph carved into the stone. Hunters chasing a buffalo herd off a cliff, a scene from a time long forgotten. I traced my fingers along the rough lines, feeling the weight of centuries. Further in, I found an object on the cave floor, a weathered leather canvas bag covered in dust. I brushed it off and opened it, revealing a rusted water canteen, a bronze compass, a leather-bound book, and to my shock, antique flintlock pistol, later dated to 1715. I dropped to my knees, grabbing the book. Its cover bore the words Le Demon, French for the demon. My mind reeled, trying to process what I was holding. Was this a relic of some long-lost explorer? A warning? Before I could think, a noise snapped me back, a sharp crack, like something breaking, echoing from deeper in the cave. I pressed on, driven to find the family. They had to be here. The cave sloped downward again, and at the bottom, My flashlight caught something that made my blood run cold. A pair of small feet, one bare, the other wearing a white shoe with pink stripes. Tears welled in my eyes as I saw her. A girl, no older than 9, lying motionless. Her face was frozen in terror, her neck and arms covered in deep, jagged wounds. Her skin was ghostly white, as if every drop of blood had been drained. Her head was twisted at an unnatural angle, her neck clearly broken. I gasped, my heart pounding like a jackhammer. My breathing grew shallow, my fingers numb with shock. The cold indifference of the universe hit me like a freight train, and I sobbed, overwhelmed by grief and horror. I fumbled for my flare gun, the only weapon I had against a wild animal. If a bear or cougar was down here, maybe I could scare it off. Then I heard it, a shuffling sound close by. Something was in the cave with me. Nausea churned in my gut, and sweat poured down my face despite the cold. My mind spun, teetering on the edge of panic. With trembling hands, I aimed my flashlight toward the sound, and what I saw ripped away any shred of sanity I had left. It was a creature, but calling it that feels wrong. It was something beyond comprehension, something that reached into the primal fear buried in every living thing. If you've ever seen pictures of Otzi the Iceman, the 5,000-year-old mummy found in the Alps, that's the closest comparison. Its leathery, discolored skin was stretched tight over a skeletal frame, emaciated and gaunt. Its mouth was a nightmare of yellow, razor-sharp teeth, dripping with fresh blood that smeared its chest. It wasn't looking at me. It was crouched over a pile of bodies, the rest of the family. The mother and other daughter had their throats torn out, necks broken. The father lay beneath the creature, its face buried in his neck, making a sickening sucking sound, like an animal desperate for water. Its eyes were closed as it fed, draining the man's life. The creature pulled back, snapping the father's neck with a sickening crunch. It let out a guttural, clicking noise, like it was satisfied. Then it turned its head toward me, and its eyes snapped open, black marbles with glowing red pupils. My mind raced with impossible thoughts. Where did it come from? What had it seen in its endless existence? It stood upright, staring at me, chattering that eerie sound. It took a step forward, and I raised my flare gun, hands shaking. I fired, the cave exploding in red light. To my horror, the creature caught the burning flare in its claw-like hand, holding it like it was nothing. I turned and ran, scraping against the cave walls, my body pushed beyond its limits. I could feel it behind me, its presence like a shadow closing in. Daylight appeared ahead, the cave entrance. I crawled up, clawing at the earth, and spilled out into the open, collapsing under a bright blue sky. The smoke had cleared, and the spruce trees swayed gently in the breeze. I stumbled to my feet, backing away from the entrance, but the creature never emerged from its subterranean lair. The rest of the team found me in shock, babbling about the family and the thing in the cave. Armed police and rangers went down later, recovering the bodies, but found no trace of the creature. I quit the next day, unable to face the wilderness again. That land, sacred and beautiful, hides something ancient and evil, something that's been feeding in the shadows for longer than humanity has walked the earth. This has occurred at least 3 times when I was growing up. I went to boarding school for my high school years, and of course there were ghost stories about every building and dorm. Some were completely ridiculous, and others, well, maybe. Anyway, our beds in the boarding school were single beds. One night, I rolled over on my side and I sighed because now I was awake. Then I heard like a mimicked sigh behind me, and before I could roll over and see who it was, I felt a weight on the bed. This thing snuggled up with me. It was cold. I could feel it was a person because it had laid against me, and for some weird reason, it felt like it was having a seizure. Well, I jumped out of bed, but there was nothing there. The thing is, in my room in my boarding school, there's only one entry or exit. When I jumped out of bed, you would have had to have run past me to get out. So I then slept in the common room that night. On another occasion back home, my parents bought me a bunk bed where the bottom bunk was a queen size and the top bunk was a single, but a good-sized one. I slept on the bottom bunk. There was a time I kept waking up in the night because I kept having nightmares, so I started leaving my bedside lamp on. One night, though, I almost pissed my pants because in my room I had a glass sliding door that opened to the front veranda. There were blackout curtains on it, but a few inches where they were off the ground. That night, I thought I saw dirty human feet showing from beneath the curtains. Sometime later on another night, I woke up just catching a glimpse of feet climbing up the steps of the bunk. Then a thump of weight on the top bunk, heavy breathing, then the whole bunk moved like someone was rolling around on top. I was the only other person who lived in the house besides my parents at the time. When I graduated and left home, I had a trusty pull-out couch I had in my room of a share house. One night after drinking, I laid face down on the couch or bed thing. I wasn't tired, but I was just laying there swinging my feet off of the edge when I felt someone sit beside me on the pull-out. I actually thought it was someone I knew even though I didn't hear the door open. So I sat up and there was nothing there but an imprint in the bed of where a person should be. I was too drunk to be scared, so I put my hand in the spot and it was ridiculously warm. Like I said, I was pretty drunk, so I later fell asleep. I want to mention one more thing. One of my housemates had a dog called Sweetie, and ironically, it was the ugliest dog that I've ever seen, but it was really friendly, and it would walk into our rooms for a visit every now and then. One day I was laying on the pull-out with the door open, so the dog walked in, and I said hello to it. The dog looked at me, then looked over to the area where there was once that imprint, and then went crazy and started barking and growling at the spot, even jumping between me and the spot on the pull-out with its hair up. And then it jumped off of the bed and out of the door, leaving a puddle of piss on the floor. I'm not terribly good with telling stories about things that happen in my day-to-day life. I tend to keep them to myself. This particular story has really affected how I live my life currently, however, as I was too scared to bring it up when I was much younger. I live in a medium-sized southern town of about 45,000 people. I know all of my neighbors and the people who go to the Kingdom Hall of Jehovah's Witnesses 3 houses down. I happen to live on the last street within city limits, and it's a pretty elderly and quiet area. The layout of the street is unique as well, making a T-shape towards the end of the main road. The left side of the T road has the Jehovah's Witnesses Church, and the right side leads to a road heading into town. At the end of this road is a small gravel driveway that leads to underbrush and a couple of abandoned houses. My youngest sister, 7, and I, 12, decided to take a walk one afternoon through the neighborhood. As we made our way to the stop sign at the end of the T-shaped road, an older woman, well into her 60s and possibly early 70s, rolled out of the dirt driveway in front of us. I had an odd feeling about this woman. I mean, she certainly didn't live in the neighborhood. My brotherly instincts kicked in, and I forced my younger sister, despite her protests, to turn around and start marching back home with me following close behind. The old woman slowly rode behind before finally driving parallel next to us. She rolled down her window and asked directions to some local store or whatnot. I can't really remember where, and I told her the basic directions. She then proceeded to insist on my sister and I hopping into her truck so she could take us home. I politely told her no, that we were on a walk, but she didn't take no for an answer and proceeded to tell us that she's a friend of my grandmother's, to which my sister abruptly blurted out, You know, Phyllis? She says, Of course, I know her. Yeah, Phyllis, we're good friends. Get in the truck. I politely declined again and insisted that we really would like to continue our walk. I forced my sister to walk lock and step at a pace that I know she can barely handle. The old woman began to yell out her window at us to get in the damn truck, adding threats that if we don't, she'll be sure to tell our grandmother how we disobeyed an adult and that we were awful children. As we finally got to the driveway, both my sister and I ran as quickly as we can down it and to the front porch, bursting back into the house. My grandmother asked how our walk was. We lied and said that we had a race. That was about it. We never talked about it again. I've never seen that woman or that truck in my neighborhood since that incident, and believe for a fact that my sister and I wouldn't be living if we had jumped into that truck. This takes place late last spring, almost exactly a year ago. At the time, my parents and I lived a somewhat solitary life out in the countryside. Other than bad cell phone and internet reception, there were other homes in the area, but not many, and they exclusively consisted of retirees and wealthy families. My parents, who were wealthy and retired, were planning a trip to Gettysburg, Pennsylvania to sightsee and visit my mom's ill mother. I've been to Gettysburg before on a class field trip and decided not to go. I had schoolwork and projects to work on that were due that Friday, and going to Gettysburg for a second time didn't seem all that interesting to me. My parents do a lot of traveling and volunteer work, and over the years they'd placed a lot of trust in me, so they had no issues with me being alone for several days or even a week at a time by the time I reached 16 years old and obtained my driver's license. So anyway, I got up the morning of their departure, and by the time I left for school, my parents were preparing to leave. When I got home that afternoon, they were already gone, and I now had 3 days alone. I spent the first afternoon and evening doing homework and gaming. That evening, I decided to drive out to the closest town and pick up a pizza for myself since I didn't feel like preparing anything. When I got home, I ate about half a pizza and after watching some YouTube, decided to turn in for the night. I woke sometime around midnight, which isn't out of the ordinary for me as I sometimes have trouble sleeping at night. I went downstairs for a glass of orange juice and decided to flip through the channels on our living room television. I was sitting there, looking at my phone more than watching the television, when I saw a light turn on through one of the living room windows. It was our garage's motion sensor light. Did my parents come home much earlier than expected? I sat quietly and waited. The light eventually turned off, and I didn't hear any noises. It must have been an animal or something, maybe a deer. I turned off the television and went upstairs and into my bedroom and lay in bed. I fell asleep not too long afterwards. I awoke to the sound of my alarm. Time to get ready for school. Oh joy. I arose, got ready, and headed out the door into my car and drove off to school. I got home that afternoon and spent the day similarly to before. I did my homework, gamed, ate dinner, and went to bed. I slept the night that night and awoke the next day and headed off to school. My mom called me during school and left a message saying that her and my dad had gotten going to stay longer than expected as my grandmother was in some pretty rough shape. I got home, and once again, the day went as it did the last two, except this time I finished up my senior project and was almost officially finished with high school. About damn time, I say. I relaxed that evening outside on our hammock and read a book until sunset, debating whether or not to travel to Gettysburg the next day to visit my grandmother. Dinner time came and went, and I decided to settle on the couch and continue reading my book. Since it was Friday, I had no school the next day and stayed up longer than usual. It was about 11 o'clock at night when I looked at my phone and noted the time. I decided to go upstairs and game for a couple of hours. Though I left my bedroom and crossed the foyer to use the bathroom sometime that night when I noticed that through one of our front door windows, the garage light was on again. That's really odd. I peered outside towards the light and saw my car, but nothing else. The light turned off, and I went to use the bathroom. I decided to grab a snack afterwards, so I went into the kitchen after using the bathroom and made a sandwich. Out of nowhere, I heard a faint tapping noise coming from one of our morning room windows. I felt on edge. I looked towards the tapping and saw nothing but blinds over the windows. Having never dealt with something like this before, I didn't know what to do. I couldn't have been hearing things, could I? I definitely didn't imagine the motion sensor light being on. I wanted to call my mom, but they were most likely sleeping by now. I waited and listened in to see if I could hear anything else. Nothing. I went upstairs into my parents' bedroom and found my dad's handgun in his dresser drawer. I sat in my bedroom and looked out of my window towards the backyard. I watched for what felt like 10 minutes or so, hoping that whoever or whatever it was would just go away. I eventually went back downstairs, and to my horror, I heard the tapping noise again, except now it was coming from one of the front door windows. The garage sensor light was on, but when I looked towards the window, I didn't see anybody. Perhaps a friend of mine was playing a prank on me or something. I have a couple of good friends who know that I'm home alone, but they've never done anything like this before. Though I texted all of them and got only one reply. Remember that friend that I mentioned at the beginning of this story? It was that friend. He denied being at my house and told me that he was lying in bed trying to sleep. I waited and waited until I could hear another noise, but about half an hour went by without further incident. I didn't see the garage light come on again, nor did I hear any other noises for the rest of the night, and so I turned in for the night after checking the locks on our doors and windows. I awoke the next morning and went downstairs to have breakfast. Afterwards, I vividly remember the previous night's events and went outside to look around the house to see if anything was out of place or peculiar. Nothing seemed to be out of the ordinary, though our patio was left untouched. None of our stuff had been moved or taken, and our shed hadn't been tampered with. I looked inside of it and didn't notice anything missing that I'd seen the week prior while assisting my dad with the yard work. I went back inside and decided to sleep for a while longer. I awoke that afternoon around 2:30. I called my mom and told her about what happened last night, and she told me to keep my dad's gun with me if necessary and to call the police if I saw anyone or heard the tapping again. She also told me that they would be home the next evening. I went on a drive later on that afternoon and stopped by my friend's house for a while before heading home. I came home later than expected and went inside, plopping myself down on the couch and watched some YouTube on my phone until nightfall. After eating dinner, I sat back on the couch and watched some more YouTube. I was dozing off on the couch when I heard the sound of someone walking on our patio. I swiftly made my way towards the back door and waited, listening for any more noises. I then had an idea. I quietly ran towards the front door and peered towards the garage to see if this person would walk towards it and turn the motion sensor light on. Then I could see if I knew the person, or at least I could see their face. And luckily, exactly that happened. I was looking towards the garage when the light came on. I saw the person light up in the night, and it wasn't anybody that I recognized. At first, I couldn't tell if it was a male or a female given their long hair that covered half of their face, and their attire wasn't noticeably masculine or feminine in appearance. What I could tell, though, was that this person was armed and was carrying a dagger. I had to call the police now. I may have a gun, but I'm way too afraid to confront this creepy-looking person on my own, especially since I was probably not going to have the guts to actually shoot him or her if they attacked me or try to get inside. Suddenly, though, we made eye contact. I felt my heart drop. I saw a smirk form across the person's face as they walked towards the front door, towards me. I jumped up and ran towards the kitchen and called 911. After being redirected to the state police barracks, I told the dispatcher that an armed man or woman with some sort of dagger was creeping around my house. I stayed on the phone with him as I heard the person tapping on the front door, presumably with their weapon. I couldn't tell you what I felt at this point. Unfortunately, the closest officer was about half an hour away from me, so I had to fend for myself until then. I tried my best to describe the person to the dispatcher, but I simply couldn't. I told her about the motion light coming on the first night, the tapping noises, and the sound of someone walking on my patio. She then asked if he or she had tried to force entry, but I said no, which was equally as baffling between the two of us. I jumped when I suddenly heard the tapping coming from behind me. I heard a deep, muffled laugh coming from outside. Well, at least now I knew it was a man. I looked at my phone after not hearing the dispatcher for a few moments, only to notice that the call had dropped. Why now? This damn reception out here in the middle of nowhere. I felt genuinely afraid at this point, so I ran up to the upper part of my foyer and lay down on the carpet and focused my attention on both halves of my house, the front door and the back door, gun in my hand, phone in the other. I didn't have to recall the barracks given the dispatcher had already called me back by the time I settled down on the ground in the foyer. My phone signal was weak, so I wasn't sure how much longer I would be able to stay on the line. As I waited, I heard the occasional tapping noise on my windows and doors. I then heard for the first time the sound of my back door being tapped. I talked to the dispatcher, who was doing her best job to keep me calm as I sat there like a scared little mouse hiding from a cat. I was so scared, even with a gun in my hand. After about 15 minutes and losing connection with the dispatcher again, the occasional sound ceased. I went into the master bedroom and looked out the window towards the road. I stared at it for quite some time when I finally saw a car driving up towards my house. Finally, the police are here. I ran downstairs and waited near the front door and watched as a squad car came into my driveway. As I watched, 2 cops came out, one coming up to the door as the other walked around the house. I opened the door and greeted the female officer who came inside. We stood there in the foyer as I explained the previous night's events leading up to tonight and then finally tonight. I also gave my description of the person. She made notes about everything while the male officer was walking around my house. After a few more questions, she told me that they'd drive around the area a couple times and recommend that my parents install a security system when they return from their trip. I felt nervous after they left, especially because the male officer was unable to find a trace of the person who was screwing with me. Hopefully, this potential burglar, or whatever they were, is now aware that this isn't a house to be messed with. When my parents returned the next day, I filled them in on what had occurred during their trip. It wasn't until about a month later when my parents finally had a wireless security system installed in our home. Luckily, nothing major happened during that month, even during the times when I was home alone. However, the story doesn't end here, unfortunately. There was another smaller incident that occurred, this time when I wasn't home but both of my parents were. I was away from home for a couple days on a fishing and camping trip with two friends from school when my mom had called me, telling me that they had suspected that somebody had been trespassing on our property late the previous evening. My dad had gone outside to investigate after noticing our garage light come on several times over the span of about an hour as he sat in the living room watching television. Of course, he found nobody, but did notice that one of our patio chairs had been moved ever so slightly. I came home and never truly felt comfortable at night, even in my locked, secured house. Sometimes at night, my mind plays tricks on me, and I imagine hearing the same tapping noise that I heard previously. Of course, I don't believe anyone is there, but I can't shake the feeling. Even a year later, I still sometimes feel like someone is outside my house when I'm awake at night.